2022, almost 16,000 cars per day passed by 7070 Hybrid Street, the New York State DOT says. This unassuming house in the affluent area of DeWitt, New York, is the location of 5 people's worst nightmares from 1988 to 2002.
As true crime content consumers, we have probably all heard of Joseph Fritzl, the man who imprisoned his daughter in this concealed basement area of the family home and then proceeded to abuse her. He kept her captive in that basement area, and he went on to incestuously father 7 children with his own daughter. The case that I'm covering today is one that similarly takes place in a homemade underground bunker, a sort of concrete dungeon as it was later referred to. And the perpetrator in this case kidnapped 5 women all at different times, and they were in that underground bunker completely alone. They were held for anywhere from a couple of months all the way up to 2 years. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. This show is made from various source documents listed in the show notes. I use news archives, documentary footage and court documents, and so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. You can find all episodes on YouTube and on podcast version in the description box down below. 14-year-old Sara had been one of these girls who was walking home on her own when she just seemingly disappeared. Now, her family were incredibly worried and they immediately called the police and reported their daughter as missing. The police came, they took a statement, and they launched a search for Sara. As time passed and the family heard nothing from Sara, all they could do was think that Sara had probably come to some terrible fate. Something really, really bad had happened to her, and they actually convinced themselves that she had died. What they didn't know was who had taken her and why they had taken her. However, all that changed just a few months later when they received through the post a handwritten letter from Sara. And this letter said that she had run away, but she was fine and she would at some point return home. Now, although this letter was written in Sara's handwriting, it was very clear it was Sara's writing. It was very unlike Sara to have done this. For her to just have run away without saying a word was completely out of character. They weren't just going to take these random letters to be the absolute truth. That was until they received a phone call. Well, they got a answering machine message on their answer phone. And this message was from Sara, and it was her voice. They could literally hear her telling them that she was okay, but she had run away, and it pretty much said exactly what the letter had said, and that she would be home at some point in the future. Now, although this didn't make much sense to any of Sara's family members, they had no choice but to just sort of accept this was the truth. It was odd behaviour, but the fact that she had let them know that she was fine was incredibly comforting to them. Meanwhile, just across town, a middle-aged man was settling his wife Dorothy into bed. Dorothy had been diagnosed recently with an aggressive form of cancer. This was the late 1980s. And at this point, she was pretty much confined to her bed every single day. And she needed constant care and support. And her husband provided that. He was her full-time carer. Her husband's name was John Jamelski. Now, John was born in New York in 1935. And by all accounts, he had a pretty normal upbringing. I say normal, this is obviously 1935, and an ordinary childhood then was very different to what we're used to. 1935, for example, was the year of the first parking meter. It was the first year that beer had ever been put into a can. So obviously beer existed and it had been bottled, but this was the first time beer in a can. It was like a really revolutionary thing. On top of that, it was the 7th ever Academy Awards. And Enterprise really was thriving. It was a very exciting time in many ways. But of course, alongside this, there were many troubling events taking place, including, of course, Hitler's rise to power and everything that went alongside that. And so John's upbringing in the 1930s and 1940s might have been ordinary to him, but is very different to what we would be used to. Eventually, John graduated from Fayetteville High School and he began working as a manual labourer. He was doing various carpentry work and other sorts of jobs. And eventually, he used the money that he had earned, as well as some inheritance from his mum and dad, to invest in property in California. And it was around this time that he also met his wife, Dorothy Richmond. She was working as a school teacher, and the pair got married. They had 3 children, 3 boys, one called Eric, one called Brian, and one called Paul. And by all accounts, that family life and those 3 boys' childhood was relatively normal again. Fast forward to the late 1980s, and of course we know that Dorothy is really suffering with her health with this aggressive form of cancer. And so her husband John is looking after her, supporting her every day. But his intention sort of drifted away from looking after Dorothy and away from family life altogether, and towards a more destructive and incredibly harmful kind of behaviour. He later said that, of course, in this instance with Dorothy being in such ill health, she was likely never going to sleep with him again. And he didn't want that. He didn't want to be in a sexless relationship, but he also didn't want to be in any other relationship of any other kind. So instead of seeking another partner or doing anything else, he decided to build this concrete bunker underneath his house. Now, his house was in this sort of upscale area of Syracuse, and the bunker itself would be completely secret. It was underneath the house. You'd have to go through the basement to get to it. And once you were in the basement, you would see this sort of storage unit. And it was only if you knew what was behind it that you could open it up. And then you would be met with this huge steel door, which you'd open up again and then crawl through this 8-foot tunnel. And you'd literally have to crawl on your hands and your knees. And it was dark, it was damp, it was cold. And then when you got to the end of the tunnel, there was a really small 3-rung step ladder down to the main bulk of this sort of concrete bunker area, which of course was soundproof, being that far away from anything. And it was cold, it was damp, there was no natural light. And the bunker itself was small. It was 8 foot by 12 foot wide and 24 foot long. So it's not a place you want to spend an awful lot of time at all. John found his first victim in 1988, so just as Dorothy was becoming really unwell. He was driving down a street near to his house, and he saw this 14-year-old girl walking along the side of the road. And so he pulled over and stopped, and he offered her a lift home. The 14-year-old, who we are going to call Sara, that's who I spoke about at the beginning. And the reason I say we're going to call her Sara is because 4 of the 5 victims' names have never been officially publicly released. So to respect their privacy, I'm going to be referring to them as made up names, but I'll let you know when that is the case. And so he offered Sara a lift and she accepted. She got into his car and they started driving, but they did not drive in the direction that Sara needed to go. Instead, they drove straight to John's mum's house. And whilst they were there, John actually took Sara into the well outside of his mum's house and he chained her up there. Specifically, he had chained her ankle up. There was no way that she could escape, but they didn't stay there for long. After that, he then took her to his house, took her to that underground bunker that he'd created, and then tied her to the 3-rung stepladder with her ankle. So her ankle was chained to that. Again, there was no way of escaping. Meanwhile, back above ground, Sara's family had, of course, become distraught at the news that their 14-year-old child was missing. They obviously got the police involved, and then we know the rest. They received those letters, they received that phone call from Sara. Of course, we know that that wasn't being done of Sara's free will. She was only allowed to write those letters and make that phone call under the supervision of John. And he had very strict instructions on what she was allowed to do and what she was allowed to say and on what she was allowed to write. Life for Sara in that concrete dungeon was quite frankly depressing. She was allowed to sleep on this super thin, foamy, sort of nothingy mattress. And that mattress would actually be the place that John would sexually assault and rape Sara. Beyond this, the way that she would go to the toilet would be sitting on this chair that had the actual seat removed, so it was just sort of a metal ring, and underneath that there was a bucket, and that's how she would go to the toilet. And beyond that, hygiene was just something that was almost non-existent. There was a bath in the bunker area, but it was this old, rusty sort of bath that had holes in it, and the only water would be coming from a garden hose, and it only produced cold water, so it was always freezing. and the drainage of the actual bath was non-existent. So there was a hole where the plug used to be, but there was no plumbing or anything. So when she would be showering herself with this freezing cold hose, the water would go straight through the bath onto the floor, and it would just sort of pool in different spots below the bath, creating this constant sort of mouldy and damp atmosphere that she would have to live in. Sara was kept prisoner for over 2.5 years, and she was subjected to emotional, physical and sexual abuse. And John said he threatened her that if she ever told anyone about what had happened, about where she'd been, or gave them any kind of description of him, then he would murder her whole family. Now, although this thought was of course terrifying for Sara, the fact that John spoke of a time when she would be able to do that in the future, when she would be able to again meet her family and be free, then maybe, just maybe, he was planning on letting her go. Of course, she had no way of really believing that this was a real and genuine thing that he was going to do, or if it was just a way of him trying to manage and manipulate her and make her more willing to just sort of do what he said, knowing that there was an end in sight. And then, after being held captive for over 2.5 years, John told Sara it was time. He was going to release her, but he made sure that he was incredibly clear. He said if she ever told anyone about what had happened to her, where she'd been, then he would kill her entire family. And he told her he wasn't joking, he was being deadly serious. And he even held up photos of her family that he had taken. He was not bluffing. And so, now aged 17, Sara was returned home to her family, and she told them exactly what John had made her promise to do. She said that she had simply run away when she was 15, and now, a couple of years later, she had decided to return home. But it wasn't long after John had released Sara, just a couple of years, that he realised he wanted another victim, someone that he could bring back and keep in his dungeon. And so he went out around the streets of Fayetteville and he started looking for another woman or girl to abduct. He slowed down as he approached a 14-year-old girl who we're going to call Jasna, and he asked Jasna if she could help him to deliver a package, to which she agreed. Now, some sources state that he knocked her out straight away, and the next thing she knew, she woke up and she was in this underground bunker. But there are other sources that state that Jasna willingly walked into the bunker, thinking that it was part of this errand that she was helping to run. And it was only then that Jasna was blindfolded and then dragged through the tunnel and chained up to that stepladder in the bunker. And just like Sara had been, Jasna was repeatedly and continuously abused. She was mentally abused, physically abused, and sexually abused. And this time, John began recording the abuse on camera. Now, this is where the lies start to sort of become quite eccentric. John said that he was part of this sex slave ring and he was taking orders from his bosses, and they were all part of the police force. So no one was coming to help Jasna, no one was coming to look for her because the police were in on it. He added that the less resistance there was from Jasna during these attacks, the quicker the bosses would be to give her an eventual release and to let her go. And that eventual release did come. Now, I couldn't find the exact dates here, but it was definitely sometime before 1997, and she'd been abducted sometime towards the end of 1995. And so John dropped Jasna outside her mother's house, where she ran inside and she immediately told her mother everything. And so the pair went straight to the police and told them what had happened, and they gave this full detailed account, or Jasna gave this full detailed account, and she even gave a description of her attacker. However, she said she couldn't direct them to where she'd been held because she just didn't know. And as the police were questioning her, they eventually let her know that because of her previous drug experience, she actually lacked credibility as a witness to this crime, even though the crime happened to her. And so although an investigation was initially launched, it was very quickly dropped. At some point over the following years, both when there were victims in the bunker and when there weren't, John used a red marker to sketch on the walls of the bunker and also to write words such as "bring on the pain" and "hate." And at one point he even wrote, "Peace to all who enter here." John really liked to decorate the space. He even hung a crucifix on the door entrance of the dungeon. And then it was in August of 1997 that John pulled up his car alongside this 53-year-old Vietnamese woman. Now, this woman did not speak very much English at all. The woman who we're going to call Anne, she was lured into John's car by him saying that he was just looking for some friends. He wanted to make some new friends. And so Anne got into the car, and the pair did talk a little bit, but it was incredibly challenging because, of course, John didn't speak Vietnamese and Anne didn't speak very much English at all. The pair drove for hours and hours before John eventually took Anne to an abandoned house that he knew of. And whilst she was there, he had obviously set this up before he'd got there, and he tied her to a set of flat cardboard boxes so that she was heavier and sort of restrained. And then he took that set of boxes with her on top, put her in his car, and then drove her to that underground bunker and locked her inside. And meanwhile, back above ground, Anne's boyfriend was becoming more and more concerned as she hadn't returned home yet. And so he waited a few days before eventually going to the police. But the police just said that because there were no witnesses and there was no evidence as to where she had gone, no leads, there was nothing that they could do, and so they couldn't investigate into Anne's disappearance. Meanwhile, back in the bunker, John was becoming more and more violent towards each one of his victims, and this time Anne was on the receiving end. He would hit her often, and one time he hit her so hard that he actually damaged her ear, permanently damaged it. It was alarmingly clear just how much he liked to put fear into his victims. In fact, one time he waited for Anne to fall asleep, and then he put a life-size skeleton next to her. Now, the skeleton wasn't real, but when she woke up, she thought it was. She thought that that was perhaps what lay ahead for her. That was her fate in the future. John used Anne for sex, and he also used her to do household chores for him. She was a sort of slave to him and also a punching bag for all of his frustrations and anger. With Anne, much like his previous victim, he had continued on this narrative of needing to record the rapes for his bosses. And there's one video that shows Anne pleading in front of a camera in a mix of English and Vietnamese. She is pleading as best she can for her release, believing, of course, that this video will go on to the bosses, these non-existent bosses, and that they'll see it and perhaps set her free. John forced Anne and all of the other girls and women to keep a diary or a journal of what happened to them, and he would make them write letters for each of the things that they'd done or had done to them. So, for example, the letter B meant bathed. It meant that they had bathed that day. T meant brushed teeth. And R meant that they had been raped by John. John, the actual kidnapper, was making them write this letter R. He knew exactly what he was doing to them, and he was forcing them to recognise it and to think about it even after the traumatic event had happened. So they were reliving it every single time they wrote that. And then in May of 1998, so around 10 months after John had kidnapped Anne, he dropped her at a Greyhound bus station and he gave her $50 cash and just left her there. Now, Anne went straight to the police and told them exactly what had happened. She had been missing for months and her boyfriend had reported her as missing. And so she outlined the abuse that had happened to her, what life had been like, and tried to give a really good description of the person who had been holding her and where she was, certainly the inside of the bunker. She described John as this man who was around 5'8". He was probably somewhere in his mid-40s and he was overweight. And importantly, she said that he had a recognisable birthmark on his head. But as far as the police were concerned, they did not take her seriously at all. They told her that they thought she was lying. And ultimately, the investigation into Anne's case didn't even really get started. I couldn't find information about why they thought she was lying or why they said this to her. But in Anne's account, she says that they did. It was just 1 year later, in 1999, that John's wife, Dorothy, did actually pass away from cancer. from this disease that she'd had for the last 11 years. And so John had been building up his secret life during this time, but when Dorothy died, he was free to do whatever he wanted to do. I should say here that we don't actually know if Dorothy knew anything about what her husband was doing. There's no evidence to say that she did. She was obviously very unwell. She was in her bed pretty much continuously for those 11 years. And I don't know what the reason would be for him building this underground bunker if Dorothy knew and she was okay with what he was doing. I suppose at the very most it could have been that this underground bunker was an area to keep the girls held in a place that they really wouldn't be able to escape from and that was soundproof. But as I say, we don't have any evidence that Dorothy knew. So as far as I'm concerned, John was on his own and he did this completely on his own. It was in May of 2002, so just a few years after Dorothy's passing, that John decided that he wanted another victim. And so he drove his car out onto the street of just a few roads away from his house in a downtown area of Syracuse. And he came across this young woman walking through this neighborhood. Now, this young woman was 26-year-old Jennifer Spaulding. She is one of the only people that we have the actual name of. And she had been at work that day at Outback Steakhouse. She'd come to the end of her shift. She'd stayed and had a few drinks with a few of her friends. And then she decided to walk home. Jennifer had taken this specific route as a shortcut home from work. And as she was walking through this shortcut, there was a group of people, some sources report it as a gang, and they were following her and intimidating her. It's dark, it's cold, and she's walking as fast as she can, and then John pulls up. And by now, she's got a bit of a pace on. She's trying to get as far away as possible from this gang of people who are following her. And so John pulls up, he offers her a lift, and she's just grateful that someone else is there. And so she agrees, she says yes, and she gets into his car. Her relief, though, soon shifted to fear and worry when she realised that John was not heading in the direction she needed to go home, but in the opposite direction. And he, of course, took her to this underground bunker and chained her to that ladder. Jennifer's family, much like the other victims' family, became completely worried and concerned when she didn't return home, and they reported her as missing. And this was very unlike Jennifer, and her family really pushed for the police to search, and so they actually sent out helicopters, but they couldn't find anything. They couldn't find any evidence or leads or sightings as to where she might be. And so that investigation that seemed like it was starting up really stopped quite quickly. Now this time, Jennifer pleaded with John, saying that her family would be looking for her. They would call the police and the police would come and find her. But John just laughed in her face. He told her that the police were part of this. This was a police force operation and they would do anything they could to cover it up. He even went on to tell Jennifer that he was thinking about selling her on the internet and that he could get around $10,000 for her. Just like the other victims, Jennifer was forced to comply with this journal writing, documenting exactly when she'd been abused, attacked and raped. And when she put up a fight, and she did put up a fight quite a lot, John would use one of his cigars to burn her skin. And this was happening often, and it happened so often, in fact, and with those horrific sort of the circumstance of the bunker, it being cold and damp and mouldy. One time he put a cigarette or this cigar on her lower back and she developed quite a bad abscess, and this got infected over and over again. Jennifer begged to be allowed to just write home to her parents, and John did agree, but of course he had veto of all of the letters, and so he forced her to write that she was in a drug rehab clinic. And when their family received this letter, they showed it to the police, and with that, the police closed her case entirely. Jennifer was held in that underground bunker for 2 months before being released. And the release came as a bit of a surprise to her. One day, John just came into the bunker, he threw her clothes at her and told her to get dressed and that he was going to let her go. And it's my understanding that all of the girls and women who were held in the bunker, their clothes were taken away from them and they were forced to live and sleep and just be naked all of the time. They were in this cold, damp, dark dungeon with no warmth and no comfort. John told Jennifer that he was going to take her home, but first he needed to put a hood over her head so that she couldn't see anything. She couldn't see where he was taking her from and where he'd been holding her over the last 2 months. For all Jennifer knew, John could be taking her to some abandoned area to kill her and dump her body. She was terrified, but she didn't really have a choice. And on top of this, John made her wear handcuffs so she couldn't escape, she couldn't get away even if she wanted to. He actually did drop her off outside of her mother's house, and Jennifer sort of stumbled inside and into her mother's arms and just collapsed and sobbed. It was decided that they would call the police immediately and report what had been happening for the last 2 months. Of course, when the police arrived to take a statement and they asked where the bunker was, Jennifer told them she couldn't say where she'd been taken. She had been under an extreme amount of stress when John had abducted her the initial time. And then when he was bringing her out, she'd had this hood over her face so she wasn't able to see or give them any information that might help them. She was, however, able to describe in detail the place that she was held, including the graffiti on the wall, the crucifix, and the actual layout of the basement. Police got her in the car and they drove round this nearby area, the nearby neighbourhoods, hoping that she would be able to identify something that would help them to find who had done this. But unfortunately, she just couldn't. Chillingly, when Jennifer thought back, she realised that she had never told John anything about her mother, where she lived. And so the only way John would know that is if he had taken the time to stalk out the address and then drop her off there later. The police did continue investigating for a little while, but eventually they cited that letter that she'd sent to her family saying that she was in a drug rehab centre. They cited that as a, quote, complicating factor. I'm not really sure what's complicated about that. There would be no record of her having stayed in any rehab clinics, of course, and how she would have gotten there, how she would have gotten the money together to pay for her stay there. They never asked her that. They never were able to explain that. And so that, on top of the fact that Jennifer spoke obviously about the constant abuse and rapes that had happened to her, and the police or the investigating team did conduct a rape kit on her, but there was no sign of sexual assault. Now, this was because John made sure that for several days before he released each of his victims, he purposefully stopped having sexual contact with them, presumably for this reason, so there would be none of his DNA on them. And on top of this, Jennifer described the vehicle that John was driving when he abducted her as a 1974 tan Mercury Comet. They searched the registered vehicle database for vehicles matching that description registered in the New York area, but they couldn't find any that matched that description. What they didn't know was that Jennifer had got the year ever so slightly wrong. It wasn't a 1974 Mercury Comet, but it was a 1975 one. And the investigating team never searched that year. They never searched any other year than the 1974, and so that never popped up. And because of this, alongside the no evidence of a sexual assault and the letter that Jennifer had sent, they decided to just completely close the case. Later on, Jennifer said, quote, "They didn't believe me, all because of the letter I wrote about the drug rehab. They thought I was making up some story or something." And then, towards the end of 2002, John struck again. This time he picked up a 16-year-old girl she was a runaway from her home in Syracuse. And we're going to call this teenager Dora. Now, Dora was kidnapped just like the other girls and women, and she was held in that bunker for 6 months. And of course she was subjected to the same horrific abuse that John had inflicted on his previous victims. The difference this time was that sometimes Dora was brought up into the house. Of course, Dorothy has passed away by this point, so there's no one else in the house. John made sure that all of the doors and windows were secure, they were locked, there was no way of escape. And during this time, Dora did actually manage to gain John's trust. She made him believe that she would never run away. She was his friend. She really humanised herself. And because of this, John did begin to trust her more and more, and he started bringing Dora outside of the house. Usually it was to do things like run different errands or do different jobs, but occasionally it was for other things, like one time he took her bowling. And then it was in mid-2003 that John brought Dora to a karaoke bar, and when they were there, they really stood out. This couple was this man nearing 60 and this 16-year-old girl. And so people did notice and they did start to talk, but that was as far as it went. No one actually said anything to the couple. No one reported this. And so they were left to just leave the bar freely. And of course, Dora was taken back to the bunker and forced to be tied up and stay there for a few more days. And then she was taken out again, and this time it was to go bottle collecting. What I haven't really spoken about much is that John is extremely rich, like mega rich. He inherited a boatload of money from his parents, and then he obviously had invested a lot of that money and money that he'd earned in property in California, and that had really multiplied. And so by this point in his life, he was worth over $1 million, which this is back early 2000s. So now that would be about $1.7 million. So it's a big chunk. Even so, John was known to be a real hoarder, and he was extremely tight with his money. So this bottle collecting that him and Dora were doing was so that he could take those bottles to a nearby bottle bank and then give them over for tiny amounts of money. And so the pair went to this bottle bank, and when they were there, Dora turned to John and she asked him if she could go to the payphone inside the bottle bank and make a phone call to a local church to find out their service hours. And by this point, John genuinely believed that he had complete control over Dora and she wouldn't do anything to upset him or to betray his trust. And so he let her go off and make this phone call. But of course, she was never going to call the church. Instead, she called her sister and she told her sister what was going on, what was happening. But as she was on the phone to her sister, she was constantly looking over her shoulder, worried that John would appear at any moment and realise what was happening. But because she was so worried about what was going to happen, she didn't actually get a chance to describe in any amount of detail where she was at, and she had to hang up before she could do that. And thankfully, Dora's sister had caller ID, and so she called this place back, and one of the bottle bank employees answered. And so Dora's sister told the bottle bank employee exactly what was going on, and John was a regular customer at that bottle bank. So the employee knew exactly who he was, and this employee knew that he was about to be headed to a nearby pet store. And that pet store was owned by the boss who owned this pet store and the bottle bank. They were linked. So the employee picks up the phone, calls the pet store, calls his boss at the pet store, and explains exactly what was going on. So the boss just waited for John to come into the pet store, and whilst he was there, he called the police and told them that they needed to come now and they needed to arrest John and save this 16-year-old girl. The police did come. Now, they were actually a little bit too late to get John at the pet store, but of course the boss and the employee know John. They know him, they know where he lives, so they direct the police to the house and they head straight there and they arrested John at the scene. Inside the house, the team found a huge amount of items, hoarded items, including 13,000 bottles, large amounts of newspapers and magazines and receipts dating back for years and years in the past. And then they found this underground bunker, or dungeon of horrors as it later became known. Inside the bunker, they found all of those journals and diaries that John forced his victims to keep. And the time span of those diaries or journals lasted over 15 years. They also found a number of videos, including the one where Anne is clearly seen on tape pleading to be let go. John refused to accept that what he had done was wrong. He clearly couldn't understand the gravitas of what he had done. And he actually told police that this was a consensual relationship. He was in a consensual relationship with a 16-year-old girl. He even went on to say that the age gap wasn't even that bad. And in fact, the worst thing, he said, and he was making a kind of joke here, he said that the worst thing was that Dora liked blue cheese and he couldn't understand that. This man who has been kidnapping people, young girls and women, this man knows that police are at his house. They are likely searching the bunker. They're going to find the diaries, they're going to find the bathtub, they're going to find the mattress with his DNA on it, and the chains and everything else, he is continuing to joke and attempting to diminish the seriousness of what he's done. It's almost as though, and this was reported, that it's like he just expected a slap on the wrist and then to go on his way. Now, of course, with all of this evidence against him, there would be no way that John could just continue pleading his innocence. But of course, this guy does. He told officers that he wasn't kidnapping the women and girls, and in fact, he was doing them a favour by getting them off the street. Looking through all of these victims, it seems that there was one genuine runaway who absolutely did not want to be with John, be anywhere near John. That was Dora. Other than Dora, none of these women wanted to run away from home. They were walking home from work, from college, wherever they were going. They were just walking home, and he comes up and takes them and says that he's doing them a favour. And for that reason, he said that he shouldn't be punished. Now, obviously, the evidence against John was ample. There was a lot of it. And so eventually he decided he had no choice but to take a plea deal, and he pleaded guilty to 5 counts of first-degree kidnapping. And for that charge, or those charges, he was sentenced to 18 years to life, and all of his assets were sold off, and then the amount of money that came from that was divided equally amongst the victims. John applied for parole in 2020 and 2022, but both times it was denied. At John's sentencing, a number of people affected read victim impact statements, quote, "A part of me died in that bunker." And another said that every night that she was in the bunker, she was plagued by nightmares and pain of knowing that her children did think that she was dead and that she had left them. With parole dates continuing to be planned for the future, she ended her statement, quote, "What if he gets out and is able to begin another regime of terror to other women?" Thank you for joining me on this week's episode of